particularly among blue states, where it's been so dramatically different in terms of how churches have been treated. It's night and day when you compare it with other states, say red states as a general rule. So I know many churches are wanting to have their voice heard this election legally and wisely. And so we're going to help them do that through the Church Finds Its Voice. We're looking for pastors and groups of pastors who want to join this to help get together pastors in their communities where we can host a breakfast or a luncheon and give them all the information and support that they need to make sure their voice is heard this election, whether it's registering voters or doing ballot harvesting. So that's something we're providing. We're working on right now in addition to our other measures and cases that we're dealing with. Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. Emily Mimnod, she's someone who has a keen talent, if you will, in researching details. And she heads up our office in Nevada. Emily, you are researching considerably regarding the private schools, and specifically a checklist on how private schools can plan to reopen now. A lot of them I'm getting lots of calls. They're saying, what do I do to reopen? Can we reopen? Do we have to have it on, at home on the internet, or can they actually have a procedure where they can reopen with confidence? What say you?
Yeah, some states are reopening schools. Nevada has, just on a limited basis of no more than 50 kids in a classroom or people. So even if your state isn't opening, or you might be one of the states that's hitting pause, it's a great time right now to start making plans, if you haven't already, about what you're going to do to address the pandemic, because you eventually, of course, you do want to open. So we've got a checklist for you, and I go through just all the areas that you'll want to think about. The first one, of course, is your CDC federal guidelines, know your state guidelines, because those will direct what you can and can't do, and they're very specific to wherever you are. And go through your insurance policies, like we talked about with the churches, so you know what you do or do not need to adjust to make sure you're in compliance and that your insurance will be valid, because you want to make sure you're protected. And that is really going to come across in the school context in staff training and education. So you want to start planning now to host virtual online trainings, if you haven't already, to help staff be familiar with social distancing, how to actually properly wear a mask, how to wash a mask. We've got links to all of that for you, but you really want to educate your staff now and start getting that information out to students. Even if they're not yet returning to school, you want them to start having these healthy, safe practices, so that when you do open, you already have all of these disciplines in place. So that's kind of the first component, is really the education and the staff updates. And you'll want to look at your employment manual, your employee handbook, your student handbook, and see what needs to be updated in that as well. And one of the strategies that we're seeing now being discussed among various medical agencies and associations is cohorting, which is where you get the small groups of students and you kind of think of them as like your home group. And you really want to reduce the amount of interaction and mixing between kind of your cohort classroom or your home group in the hallways and going from classroom to classroom. So the next thing that you start thinking about is really structurally scheduling. How are you going to adjust really the mechanics of how you operate? And so what a lot of schools are thinking about, and what we're seeing discussion, is really a suggestion that you try to identify these cohort groups and kind of keep that cohort classroom as your nucleus for your students, so that they're not, intermingling with other kids. So if you have, lunch breaks, if you're meeting for a full day, you'll want to stagger, your lunchtime so that those groups stay together. You want to stagger your drop off and your pickup times again, so that you're not having as much overlap in the parking lots and in the hallways. And so we're just going to go through all of these different considerations. But you want to start communicating that now, because we've seen a lot of, and I'm sure you've seen it too, a lot of discontent over potential changes to scheduling, be it from the teacher perspective, from a student perspective. So it's something you want to be thinking about, now.
Okay. Now, Emily, I know that there's been some school districts that have talked about, especially private Christian schools, have talked about requiring all their students to wear a mask all day, every day at school, not just in between classes, but while sitting there in the classroom, safe distancing, also outside, uh, running, always wearing a mask. Let me ask you first off, is that actually required at this stage for private Christian schools or private schools or even public schools to have to do this coming fall? That is, a student wearing a mask all the time, always. Is that anticipated to be the mandate? Is that what we've heard so far? Because a lot of parents are thinking about just taking their kids out of private schools, saying that they don't want their child wearing a mask all day.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what we're seeing across the states that have adopted, including Nevada, have adopted a mask mandate in public. There's never going to be a mandate that you must wear a mask all the time whenever you're in public, simply because it's not safe, medically speaking. There are people who have respiratory problems, and the directives that I've seen almost always acknowledge that. They don't usually require you have a medical note saying that you have a respiratory problem, but it acknowledges the fact that if you do have a respiratory problem, it is not probably safe for you to be wearing a mask. So no, there's not going to be a mandate where you must wear a mask all the time in public, but you want to look at your local guidance, your state directive very carefully and see if it's really an individual imposed mandate or if it's more business focused or school focused. So here in Nevada, they've really worked to put the onus of enforcing the mask requirement on the organizations and on the schools, or well, what would be the schools, on the businesses.
Okay, on the businesses. So such may be for the same for private schools in states. They may be their responsibility to carry out what that mandate is. Let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say that your state doesn't require a child to, in a private school or public school, to have a mask on all the time, but it says they have to have it on if there's not safe distancing, necessarily. So like when the kids are, going from one class to another, they're in the hallways, kids are bumping into each other. Let's say that that's the rule. They have to wear a mask for that. But if you can have safe distancing in the classroom, you have safe distancing outdoors where the risk is much, much lower, that the mandate doesn't require that. However, let's say a school, though, in that situation says, you know what, we're just going to clearly play it safe. We don't want to be sued. We don't want liability. So we're going to require every child, no matter what, just to wear a mask all day long, every day of the week. Does that have a potential downside to it from a legal perspective if they do something that it's beyond the mandate of the law that they have to do? Can they be is it possible for them to potentially be liable or sued if their extended mandate results in some kind of injury or harm to a child that they may not be aware of, maybe a child with an immune disorder or a respiratory issue or something like that?
Yeah, you really want to make sure you're following the law, but you don't want to be unsafe. And so if you're going above and beyond and you're doing it for the right reasons because you want to keep children safe, you might end up going in the other direction, because if a student does have a respiratory problem and you don't know about that, they need to be opted out. And so what we're suggesting is you really put that on the parents to inform you whether or not it's safe for their child medically to be wearing a mask. And I think that will keep you in compliance with the law and also keep your risk low. And of course, most importantly, keep everyone safe.
Right. And they could have a required letter from parents saying, if your child has a health issue, or some of the issues, or that you feel warrants your child not wearing a mask, please sign this and send it back to us. So there's some things that schools can do to help protect themselves. One, I think, is first make sure they meet the minimum mandate, whatever it is. Number two is if they go beyond the mandate and more extreme, be aware of it. There's a potential liability that they could be bringing upon themselves in addition to fewer kids going to school. And then in addition, a good way of mitigating that liability is having, at the very least, parents being able to make that decision and to opt their child out from wearing a mask. I think that we'll see many schools. Some schools will be very radical. I think that's very dangerous potentially if they require a mask to be worn all the time, everywhere, always. I see that as very problematic, especially when there's health information out there from credible sources saying that that's actually not the best interest of a child. Right now, the coronavirus, the fatality rate for children under the age of 18 is the same as a regular flu. So it can be somewhat, I think, problematic if the masks do end up resulting in an injury. I think some schools are going to take a more moderate approach where they require a mask if there's not safe distancing, i.e. in the hallways, going to and from classes, or if safe distancing isn't available or possible in the classroom as far as distancing the desks and from each other. I think those are some of the things that they're going to be looking at, but I think most school districts at the end of the day are going to really try to balance it to make sure they're not in any way assuming a legal concern or even a health concern by zealousness to play it safe, so to speak. So I think that's, I appreciate it. Now you have a checklist. This is very important. Folks, the checklist that Emily has put together is going to be available on our website, pacificjustice.org, actually pji.org, pji.org, and that will be ready and available after this call. So give us a half hour at least after this call, and we'll have that up and there on our website. I highly recommend it, not only that you look at it as if you have a private school, but also public schools take a look at it, and also forward this to private schools that you may be aware of that may not know about this. This could be very helpful. If you know a parent who's frustrated or concerned about what their school's doing, this could be helpful and they could forward it on as well. So we really put in our time. Emily Mimnaugh is one of our star research attorneys and has just done an absolutely fantastic job looking under every rock to make sure that we've covered all the bases. That said, if you find there's something in this checklist that we're not covering, let us know. Maybe there's something we missed, and we'll be happy to look into that as well. Now, to talk about masks, and then we're going to talk about the case out of Montana, we have with us here Kevin Snyder. Kevin is the Chief Counsel Attorney for the Pacific Justice Institute. He's out of our Sacramento, California office. And Kevin, give us some insight about the mask mandate. I know some churches are wondering, do they need to require everyone in their church to wear a mask? Are they going to get sued if someone, or get prosecuted if someone in their church doesn't wear a mask and undercover police come to their church and see that someone's not wearing a mask? Should churches be concerned about this? And what's all involved in this mandatory requirement for across many parts of the country for people to have to wear masks?
Brett, it's good to be with you this afternoon. And to approach the issue of masks, one has to, because it's different from state to state, the first thing to look at is this a guidance or is it a mandate, which is sometimes I'll use the word order. If it's guidance, that means it's not required, obviously. If it's a mandate, of course it is required. So look at that first. Secondly, when you look at the rules, look at who is the enforcing authority. In other words, who is the onus this is on? Is this on, usually they will call it the business or the entity. Does this group have to enforce it and not let people in? If you're in a state where that's the case, then of course you would have to enforce that regarding the congregation. But if the rule applies to the individual, then the church does. I'm sorry, the school or church or whatever entity doesn't have to act as the enforcer. They are not the police officer in this instance. It is up to the individual, and the individual could be cited. So that's the primary thing: is look to see first, is this a guidance or is it an order? Second, who has the enforcement authority? Is it on the individual or the entity, say the school?
Okay, very good. What about the case out of Montana? The Supreme Court ruled on involving, I understand Montana had a policy providing financial benefit to parents who are choosing to put their kids in a secular, non-religious private school. A lawsuit was filed saying, hey, this isn't right. I should put my child in a religious school, not just a non-religious school. What happened in this case? And I think it's a very important case for religious freedom.
Yes, this came down Tuesday. So right off the presses from the Supreme Court, Espinoza versus Montana. In that case, the legislature passed a law that would allow parents to give a tax credit. In other words, give some money towards a school, and it goes through a third party rather than directly the government. But in any event, that money can be used towards either a religious school or a secular school. Oddly, a department within the state of Montana unilaterally declared it unconstitutional, not the legislature, no one else. And the attorney general would not defend them in court. Nonetheless, parents took this to court and won all the way up to the Montana Supreme Court. The Montana Supreme Court, relying on what's something called a Blaine Amendment. That's an anti-Catholic amendment that you'll find in about 38 states. And it says that no direct or indirect public funds can go to any sectarian church or school. So they said the Supreme Court said that this violates the Montana Constitution. So the parents took it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, look, it may in fact violate the Montana Constitution, but the Montana Constitution, if it's applied in this manner, violates the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. The reason is you have two schools, one secular, one religious, and you're treating them unequally, and that's a violation of the free exercise clause as to the religious school and as to the parents who choose to send them there.
Okay, so the court basically held then that states, you don't have to have vouchers or tax credits if you don't want to, but if you do, you can't just isolate it to just benefit non-religious, secular private schools. You have to treat everyone neutrally and also allow it to apply to parents choosing religious private schools. That's a great decision, and I think it's a reinforcement of another case that was for equal and neutral treatment by the government of religious institutions dealing with government programs, government benefits, and things like that. So this was a good case. It's broader in its potential assistance for religious freedom than what we just talked about, but specifically should be very encouraging for those of you out there in states that are somewhat friendly or potentially friendly to vouchers or tax credits for private Christian schools as well as secular private schools. Kevin, thank you very much for that important update, and I think it should be very encouraging for those with private schools. Now, I want to shift, if I can, now to our New York office. We have with us there the attorney who heads up the New York office that serves both New York and New Jersey, Mishael. Mishael, thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to have you on our team. I know you actually interned for the Pacific Justice Institute about 20 years ago, and at our Sacramento office, and I'm just so glad for you to be a part of our team with all the experience you've been able to achieve over the last 2 decades. Now, if you can give us a brief update on what's going on with the churches, the private Christian schools there on the East Coast. My understanding is it's still very arduous for them to function. Is that changed, or where are we at?
I mean, it's gradually, thank you, Brad. It's gradually improving. Let me just start with New Jersey first. So, for example, this weekend, my own church is going to be opening up. Normally when we have services, our services are from like 9:15 to 1, but they're limiting us to about an hour and a half. And a lot of us, we're just glad to be able to see one another again, but they're limiting services right now for us. Indoor services, the capacity is 25%, but Governor Murphy is gradually increasing that limit. Now we're at 100 people. Before it was at like 25 people, then 50 people. It's at 100 people right now for indoor services. Outdoor services, the gatherings are limited to 250 people, but religious gatherings and political activities, that they have no numerical limit. That's for New Jersey. Now, for New York, right now, many of the regions are in phase 4. The capital region is in phase 4 today. New York City is going to be starting phase 3. The last executive order that we had basically said that indoor services was limited to 33%. Outdoor services could go beyond that as long as there was social distancing. But then a recent federal case that was just decided is probably going to change that. And I don't know if you wanted me to go into that real quick. Or
important case and how the judge came about his decision, especially in view of the role that the protests took in his actual conclusion. Please explain that, because it's going to be very helpful us potentially in our other cases that we filed in a number of states, arguing basically the same argument that the judge made.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief on this. Actually, this case involved 2 Catholic priests and 3 Jewish congregants who sued Mayor de Blasio as well as Governor Cuomo. They were seeking injunctive relief. At the time, houses of worship were limited up to 25% capacity compared to like other non-essential businesses that were allowed up to 50% capacity. So they were alleging like First Amendment free exercise clause, free speech, and assembly. Just a little bit of background with the priests. The priests were forbidden from offering mass and sacraments. People couldn't leave their cars. With the drive-through mass, they could not receive communion. And then with the congregants, which the Jewish congregants, I really felt bad about as I read this, is that, you know, for them, drive-through services was not going to help them because, you know, according to their faith, they do not operate a vehicle on the Sabbath. But and with some of the congregants, there were incidents where the police came to the premises, told them that their gathering was illegal, threatened them with fines and arrests. There were other congregants that had a constant police presence there at their synagogue. So really, they didn't feel comfortable worshiping in peace. So the court granted the injunction enjoining the governor and mayor, basically where they could not enforce the limitation against the plaintiffs greater than that was imposed for those that were in phase 2 industries. The reasoning I thought was rather interesting because in the decision, the court did acknowledge that we have been facing a global pandemic, that the governor and the mayor, they've been addressing it, but the court just disagreed on how the rules and regulations were being implemented. And then like in terms of the protests, the court talked about that and the fact that so many people were congregating together, not engaging in social distancing. Some did wear masks and some did not. And so the response of the governor and mayor to the protests as they related to the orders in place were more relaxed, you know, with the governor saying that the protests could proceed in a smart way, which is something that the governor really has been talking about, whether it's protests or other things. But the court felt that that was inconsistent.
Right. So I think that was a real important point of this decision, is the fact that they looked at these demonstrations, these big protests, and said, basically, bottom line, government, if you're going to allow them to have protests, then you've really lost your legitimacy in denying the ability for religious institutions to be able to meet and have church services or synagogue services. I think that's very important because it's going to be helping us in, as we argue that in the lawsuits that we filed in California, Washington State, and other states. So I'm very encouraged about that. By the way, we are preparing litigation in more states. So if you're not receiving our case updates, please, I encourage you to do so by signing up to our Legal Insider newsletter on our website. But if you're watching this, then you may have already opted in on that. So we'll be keeping you updated with these kinds of cases as they progress. But what you just said, I think is very important, Michael, because this shows, I think, why it was so important for us to open an office there in New York serving the East Coast, because there is such hostility. It's much more restrictive, less tolerance. You got Mayor de Blasio of New York City, who says, well, protests are different, but what they have to say is really important, more important than the message, the messaging of churches. That kind of a mindset is all too common on the East Coast. And that's why what she's doing with our new office there, serving on the East Coast, is so important. I once had someone say, well, Brad, why are you opening an office there? Don't you have, there's other people on the East Coast that can deal with these things. Well, the reality is, the reason we're there is because we're taking on cases many times that other organizations won't even try. We don't cherry pick. We don't just go for those certain high profile cases. We make sure everyone gets help. And the bottom line is there are people on the West Coast, churches and others, that were calling upon us who could not get help anywhere. And it was becoming very problematic. And so God opened up the opportunity, and we're really glad to have Mishael as part of the team at Pacific Justice. So keep it up. Keep up that great work. We really appreciate it. Now, I want to now shift to Oregon with Ray Hackey. Now, Ray filed a lawsuit on behalf of a number of churches and was able to get an injunction declaring the governor's shutdown order null and void. It was very powerful. An emergency stay was granted by the state Supreme Court, and they later reversed it. That said, Ray is in the process of filing another lawsuit with a different legal premise, one that's actually going to be benefit, I think, tremendously because of that federal New York decision that we just talked about. Ray, give us a heads up on that briefly, and what do you need now? What can people, especially from Oregon, do to help us move this case along?
Well, basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to strike while the iron is hot in the Portland area. Basically, if you look at Governor Brown's executive orders, she places limits on both civic gatherings as well as religious gatherings or faith-based gatherings in her order. Now, basically, if you look at the protests that are going on in Portland, basically there's no limit to the number of people who can show up. There's no social distancing. None of that is being enforced, but yet churches are being hamstrung. If a county is in phase 1, they can only have 25 people show up, no matter how many people they can accommodate. If their county is in phase 2, they can host up to 250 people with social distancing. And even though that's far less restrictive than the 25-person requirement in phase 1, there are churches that can accommodate significantly more than 250, even with social distancing, and they should be able to, especially since dining establishments are given, discretion as to how many people they can get in with social distancing. So, I mean, it just feels like her orders with regard to churches are arbitrary and discriminatory, and we want to make sure that, and basically we want to, and so right now what we're hoping for is a church that has 250 people or more that it can accommodate. We already have one small church that already feels like it can't do what it needs to do because of Governor Brown's orders. We need a larger church, and if we can get a couple more, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so a church, what we're looking for is, first off, say a church in the Portland area that's phase 1, where they're only allowed up to 25 people at the most. That would be a great plaintiff to add to this case. So a church, if you're in phase 1, a church in phase 1, they would be a great plaintiff for this case. Or a church that has over 250 people that meet, and maybe they're in phase 2, but they still can't meet as a church, and they're still having unequal treatment because the standards are greater on them than on restaurants and other places. Well, that'd be a good plaintiff to have as well. So this is something you can help us with, folks. Perhaps you know of a pastor of a church there in Oregon, Portland, or in the general Oregon area that may be hindered in doing what God's called them to do. This could be very, very helpful. Ray Hackey is an excellent attorney. He's the PGI Bulldog, I call him, and does an excellent job defending religious freedom and churches there in the Oregon and in the state of Oregon. So I encourage you to contact us. We cannot challenge this unless we've got the right plaintiffs. And if this goes unchallenged, you can expect us coming back again and again and again. Dr. Fauci recently came out and says, "Oh, we may have the swine flu coming. It's in China in animals, but if it jumps over to humans, we can have a big swine flu epidemic." And it's like he's talking about that as the same as what we're going through with the coronavirus. So this could come back again and again and again. That's why we have to buck up and say, the bell's tolling. I'm going to be responsible. I'm not having to give up my life. I'm not having to, leave the country. I'm just simply needing to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit to protect our civil liberties for ourselves and our posterity. So I don't think we're asking too much. We'll pick up all the costs, all the expenses. That's what we do. Contact us at Pacific Justice Institute, specifically if you're in Oregon and you have a church up there. That could be a big help to us right now. You guys are our watchdogs, so I greatly appreciate that moving forward. Now, let me talk real briefly before we go into Q&A, and regarding Governor Gavin Newsom's order out of California. His decision, he came up with an order restricting 19 counties, pretty much so the most populous counties, but I think with the exception of San Diego County. I didn't see them on the list unless they've been added. But these counties are basically told in a broad sense that you cannot have indoor meetings. It was very, very stringent, and only outdoor, so restaurant eating outdoor, picking up food, but no indoor meetings. He did not mention, he mentioned a number of things like restaurants and stores and things, but he didn't mention, in bars, he did not mention churches. But he seemingly had a sweeping, indoor meetings or indoor gatherings. So why did he not mention churches? That's the question a number of you have asked me, and pastors have called me over the last 24 hours quite a bit while trying to talk about this. Let me give you my heads up on it and how I think we should deal with this. First, I think the reason he didn't mention churches is because of the fact, number one, he knows that many churches, hundreds of churches, will not abide by that. They're done. They've had shutdowns. Fatality rates are going down. They can do safe distancing, safety measures, specifically using our safety checklists that Attorney Emily Minoff put together. It's on our website. They can do those things. They're done. They're going to continue to meet. And if the governor is aware of that and he's got some problems, number one, it's going to be difficult for him to go in and arrest and criminally prosecute from the state level. This is something really to do with local governments, cities, or if you're just in the counties. And a lot of cities and counties have made it clear they're not going to enforce this against them. You mentioned about the California Highway Patrol is going to be utilized to help enforce this. I don't think the California Highway Patrol is going to veer off, half a mile from the freeway and snoop inside a church to see what's going on and then make arrests. I don't think we're going to see that. I think that's more just a threatening talk, maybe more applicable for the beaches, for example, perhaps. Now, the other reason I believe he's not moving on this and didn't mention churches is specifically because of that case that was just mentioned out of New York City. The reality is that judge said, hey, if you've got protests over here that the state has allowed, you can't discriminate against churches because they have First Amendment rights, free exercise rights to be able to gather and to meet. So government, you don't really have a legitimate, compelling state interest if you're going to allow people over here and massively protest in a very sloppy way without masks and things like that, and then not allow churches. That decision is not binding on California, but it is a federal district court decision. So it's something that any judge ruling from this point forward on the issue of churches' rights to gather are going to have to address that case. Either they're going to have to distinguish it based on the facts, or they're going to simply have to disagree with it up front. So it really increases the chance, the risk that the state has of losing a lawsuit and credibility and civil damages if they move on and apply this specifically to churches. So long and short of it, I think churches are somewhat safe in terms of, number one, it doesn't specifically mention churches, although it has some broad general language. And number two, I don't think the governor, even if he does intend it down the road, I don't think the governor is going to enforce it or will be able to enforce it. And this would have serious potential legal risks and possibly political risks for this governor if he goes down that route. So churches who are meeting, I think, generally speaking, I think they should feel fairly safe to continue meeting. If they're meeting in violation of the local city codes or what the city policy is or the county policy, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. And you should definitely contact us at Pacific Justice Institute to weigh your options as we move forward. Once again, as always, outdoor services are much, much easier to protect, both in terms of legally and in terms of health and safety, than indoor services. that's just one of a number of factors to take into consideration depending on where you are in your situation. So we're going to bring in some questions now, and let's delve right into it. Okay, can we defy the new orders that do not allow singing during service, since this is so essential to our faith? Our church is currently sits everyone 6 to 8 feet apart, and everyone wears masks during singing. Can we sing if we have all that in place? Kevin, I'm going to call on you for that one. What about that? Should a church feel free to be able to sing and have a worship time? That is a pretty basic part of worship services.
Brad, it is a basic part of services. The question, again, whatever state you're in or counties, you look to see if it's a guidance or an order. If it's a guidance, you do it, you can follow it or not. Take your health into your own hands. If it is an order, look to see if it is against the entity, in other words, the church, or against the individual. So if you're an individual and want to sing, they would have to have the police come in and cite you there. Highly unlikely. Also, typically those are not directed towards people on stage.
Okay. Yeah, and I also understand that the mask mandate does have some exceptions. One is if it's the person's health, it would be hindered because they're wearing a mask. Say they have certain respiratory issues, asthmatic perhaps, or immune system issues. So that is one out. The other is dealing with people needing to engage in lip service. They're not, or lip syncing, excuse me. So they're lip reading, excuse me. There we go. Finally got it. Anyway, so they're having to, they're deaf, or they don't have good hearing. They're having to read people's lips. In that scenario, pastor, worship team, people interacting in that context do not have to wear a mask, because as a matter of policy, the state did not want to hinder dramatically the ability for people who are deaf or having difficulties hearing from being able to have the same opportunity for interaction and understanding what's going on and messaging, et cetera. So those are two exceptions, I think, also that apply. Okay, and not all states have those exceptions. California does. I understand. I think some other states don't. So please be sure to check out your state. Are we talking about guidelines or laws? There is no law you have to wear a mask. Kevin, is that true? There's no mandate that people have to wear a mask?
Yeah, again, looked from state to state. Let me give you an example. In California, CNN and National Public Radio put together some pieces that said that Gavin Newsom had ordered the wearing of masks outside in public places. So if you look on those and you click the order that they have as a hyperlink, it goes to a Twitter feed. That's not an order. What he says as a press conference is not an order. We respect those in authority, but in our system of government, he cannot speak into existence orders. And so now in some states, there are, in fact, orders, and you have to obey those orders.
Okay. So I think some are expecting the governor to possibly put this in writing, to pronounce it as an order, but unless it is him just sending out a tweet, it's not a binding order, and that's important to take in consideration. I know if your church usually meets on Sundays, I wouldn't allow the governor's verbal edict, if you will, to keep you from meeting. It's not a binding order. It's not written. It's not signed at this point. But even if it is, once again, you have those exemptions and you have those reasons why I think a church would be safe in the event that his edict is codified and in writing and signed as an actual order. Very good point. In California, does anyone know what will happen when someone at the school tests positive? I've heard they have to close for 14 days, and I've heard they have to close 72 hours. What happens if if that happens in California, someone at a school tests positive. Anyone have any idea on that one? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to participate. Emily, yes.
Hey, it will depend on your local health authority. They can shut down the school, but that will depend on what the outbreak was. If somebody tested positive, if they're actually symptomatic, etc. It is a recommended 10 to 14 day isolation period if you are symptomatic or if you test or quarantine. But they would not necessarily shut down the school. It would depend.
Okay, so it would depend. All right. Next question. The
Oh,
father.
I should also add, in that case, they do recommend wherever the individual is who becomes ill at the school, that you actually, if you can, kind of just quarantine off that room wherever they were for 24 hours before you actually clean it, which was interesting to me.
Okay, very good. Very good. I appreciate that detail. That's great. Okay, from what I understand, you don't have to wear a mask outside if you are far enough away from other people. I read the mandate carefully. I read the mandate a couple of weeks ago. That is correct. And it's sort of sad. I mean, when I'm driving and I see someone walking in a crosswalk, there's no one around, and they're wearing a mask. You know, generally speaking, it's not healthy to wear a mask. You're healthier if you don't wear a mask, as a general rule. Masks are there to help deal with risks, real risks. Well, you don't have any real risks when you're outside and there's no one around you. So it's when you're outside and you don't have safe social distancing, that's where the mask mandate is applied. So very good point. Our church children's ministry director forwarded a waiver created by a different church that could potentially be used when dropping off kids for Sunday school ministry. During the PGI calls, it seems to me like waivers have mostly been discouraged. Am I understanding this correctly, or is this something that would be wise for our church to create? Kevin, why don't you touch on that?
Sure. I've looked at some waivers, and here's the thing, is if you are not following a law, a public health order, your waiver will not help you. You cannot contract out of an unlawful act. Now, if there is no public health order at issue, then certainly a waiver would be a good idea.
Right, and when we talked about it at the time, there was a clear rule prohibition binding even it was not going to get them out of that. But as we're dealing with churches now that can legally have church services, some counties that are saying we're not going to enforce it, go ahead, or cities passing referendum ordinances saying we're not going to enforce this, churches go ahead, then it might actually be advisable for a church to utilize waivers in those situations, right? Yes,
and again, think of the activity that the youth or the children are doing. Are they doing something that even though they're allowed to meet, are they doing something that would be inconsistent with the public health order, like grabbing hands in a circle and singing "Ring Around the Rosie" like they do? That you can't waive their little rights to that.
Right. Okay. So there's still a responsibility that the church or the Sunday school department is going to need to take into consideration in implementing anything that they do. The waiver's not going to get them out of negligence, but it's still something that they can do. And I want to say, if you have a waiver that you'd like Pacific Justice to look at, we'd be more than happy to do that. Just contact our office in Sacramento. Okay, next question. What are the state mandates concerning schools? How can private parochial schools open in August or September? Can private schools ignore the state mandates? I think that's probably an Emily question. Emily?
No, you will not be able to ignore the mandates. They're binding on public spaces, so I would not think that would be a viable strategy.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Regarding singing, protesters in Santa Clara County were shouting chants, and their protests were endorsed by the county supervisors and mayor of San Jose. isn't there an inequity here in the 14th Amendment? I mean, that's a very good point. Let's see who else we can answer that. Let's try Kevin. We'll try Kevin on that one. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a point well taken. And actually, the case that Mishael was discussing is spot on. And you can't essentially differentiate between the content of what is being communicated, and that's what's happening.
Yeah, when that happens, and I think she did a great job explaining that case so that people can understand that and utilize that. The bottom line is, as she described, if the government is going to allow protesters to meet and to shout and do whatever, then they can't have greater restrictions on another group, i.e. churches, simply because of the church being religious or having a different viewpoint. That I think is going to be very valuable for us as we move ahead. Very important case, and it's very encouraging to us in our litigation that we have filed already and we'll soon be filing. Next question. I run a 2-day-a-week homeschool program in Santa Clara County. That is structured like a school, but technically is not a school as we do not file an affidavit. We are more like a well-organized tutorial program. So do we have to follow the school requirements for reopening? That's a very good question. Who'd like to take that one? Emily?
I would think that you would fall into the category. I would need to look at the Santa Clara order specifically, but I'm guessing they're not defining schools as narrowly or as technically as would be preferred, I think.
Yeah, so even if let's give a hypothetical. Let's say they say schools have to, or well, they meet at least say 3 days a week, and they're only meeting 2 days a week. I think at the very least from a liability perspective, even if they're not technically a school, that it would make good sense for them to follow those same basic standards moving forward, and be sensitive to that, at least from a liability perspective and a negligence perspective. Is that your take too, Emily?
Yeah, that would be right. You want to be able to point to that and say we were, following that. If something, God forbid somebody gets sick, you want to be able to point to that and say we were complying.
Yeah. And yeah, okay, good question. Next question. If parents sign a waiver noting that they are aware of the risk of contracting COVID if they attend school, will that hold up in court? I've heard conflicting statements that you cannot sign such a waiver for children. So what about in that context, as far as a private school signing a waiver, is that going to, completely let the school off the hook if a child gets COVID and say there's a very rare exception, it has a serious outcome? Kevin, do you think that waiver would get them off the hook if in and of itself, or do they need to have compliance?
Well, they have to comply with whatever lawful public orders are in place. And I think I hope that's one thing people are getting from this, is if you have a lawful order and you're defying it, or you can't have people waive that. It's against public policy to have a contract that violates a law.
Okay, great. Okay, are we done? All right, that's pretty much a little repetition. Okay, great. Folks, if you have more questions, feel free to contact our office, or you can join on, ask these questions next week. We're gonna have another Zoom call, and it's gonna be very important because a lot of things are changing now in terms of the new state mandates. Basically, states are becoming more restrictive now. Look like first they were loosening things, now we're seeing greater restrictions. And the key thing that we're watching at Pacific Justice Institute is the extent to which these new restrictions are unequally applied and enforced, number one. And number two, specifically to what extent these restrictions are going to be limiting churches in view of the recent case precedent out of New York that really gives them an upper hand, if you will, to distinguish their rights to be able to be open amidst greater restrictions taking place. Once again, also, we have a great checklist. It's free. It's a 96-point checklist for churches. We have this other checklist that will be available probably the next 30 minutes online at pji.org without charge, dealing with private religious and Christian schools. So we look forward to serving you moving forward in the days ahead. I want to also thank all those churches out there, individuals that are supporting the work of Pacific Justice Institute. It is greatly appreciated as we work so hard uniquely to make sure that everyone gets help and that no one's left on the side of the road. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Now, Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for what you've given us, the freedoms you've given us, Lord. Let us be faithful, Lord God, with these freedoms. They didn't come from man, Lord God. They came from you, and our founding fathers understood that. Father, let us take that to heart, especially this 4th of July. Let us be reminded of not only how valuable our freedoms are and our liberties, but also from where they came from, and our responsibility to deal with them, to use them, and to protect them respectfully towards you. We give you the glory for what you're going to be doing in our nation in the days ahead, and the opportunities we have to live and be a shining light to the world around us that is so in need of you and your love and your guidance. And we thank you now and for the courage you give us as believers. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you again, everyone. Let's not be discouraged. Let's keep the faith.